Welcome to the Spirit of Business, episode number 71, Firing the Devil's Advocate with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Matt. I would like to ask you about protection. You're very protective in relation to my business, which I appreciate, even if it's sometimes slightly annoying, but I really appreciate that instinct that you have to protect. And we had a conversation recently, and you were talking about accountants and how an accountant's job is also to protect a business. And it made me start to think about where the lines are. Clearly, protection is important. We all need to protect. We build protection around ourselves to protect ourselves from weather and adverse events and things like that. So it's an important part of life. And we also know of people who can be overprotective. We know of people who take risks that are crazy risks and they just land them in trouble. So I thought it'd be really interesting to explore where protection is really powerful and where it's not really powerful and how we discern the difference.
Yeah, there's so many things that I think of when I think of the word protection. And yes, you're right. I feel like I am a protectionist as an individual. And what I question is whether that's innate behavior or whether it's learned through the craft or the trade of being an accountant and learning about ethics and learning about the rules and regulations that we have to live by in terms of business and about government authorities and those sorts of things. And so therefore, it's an interesting question, and a whole lot of things come up for me because I'm a business owner. I'm an advisor to business. I run an accounting firm. So there's a whole lot of different sort of hats that I would wear on a daily basis that probably have different thought processes or different things that I have to think about when it comes to protection. If I start with sort of the one that you mentioned about a business owner. And so my role as an advisor to business and advisor to individuals that are running businesses, I think that I naturally go into this protection mode to support the business to ensure that it achieves what it needs to achieve. So there's this balance that goes on, and I see this also in board meetings, and I see this with business owners in general. And if I just try to take larger business and I take board meetings so that I'm a lot more structured, I find that there's a lot of people and a lot of boards now that spend too much time on risk and not enough time on the creativity and strategy of an organization. So they become, I think the balance gets wrong from a protection point of view. So they actually are thinking about all the things that could possibly go wrong from a risk point of view and not think about all the things that could possibly go right and from a creative strategic perspective. So it's a really interesting dynamic that goes on. And I've seen that, that there's been this shift over the last 20 years where I think we've become a lot more risk orientated, and that's probably largely due to the landscape of the legal system in which we operate and the government authorities in which we actually have to stay inside of, and the litigious nature of the world too. I think all these things are at play as to why maybe there's been a pendulum shift towards risk, and I see this probably, as I say, more in a larger business sense or in more sophisticated business sense. When you shift back into sort of the SME marketplace, the small to medium sized enterprise with a business owner, there's probably less focus on risk and more on the creative strategy sort of type thing that occurs because of the fact that they're just trying to get on with business. And so probably why I come into that scenario a lot more is that I can see all the things that could possibly go wrong and therefore have to be that reminder to say, well, that's great strategy and that's great creativity. However, what you have missed is potentially X, Y, and Z actually occurring because of my experience with maybe in seeing a lot more things that can go wrong in business. And so therefore I can become a bit of a protectionist or maybe be seen as a bit of a risk person with business owners like yourself, because when I'm reading a contract or a shareholders agreement or something that is designed fundamentally to protect a person, I will go into that, all the things that could possibly go wrong mode, because not because it's fantasy, but because I've seen it as a reality. So yeah, I think that, and then if you then shift me into my running my own accounting firm, I see risk every day with our own business, and we've got licenses to protect, and I've got to deal with government bodies in different ways that other normal trading businesses don't necessarily need to think about. So I'm surrounded by risk every day, and therefore it's probably it would probably necessarily mean that that's pretty much why I end up moving down the risk profile to becoming more risk orientated or protectionist, because I can see the things that can actually go wrong.
Well, there's an irony in there, isn't there? Because the more regulated we are, and therefore the more the government is trying to protect somebody from risk by creating regulations, the more risk it creates for the people who have to protect those businesses, like the accountants. So on the one hand, they're trying to decrease the risk, but they kind of increase the risk to balance it. It seems to me they go hand in hand. So then you start to want to pull it all apart and see what's the role of risk and what's the role of protection in a healthy business and in a healthy society.
You're right. I really hadn't thought of it from that perspective before, about risk and protection, and about the role of governments and the lawmakers in terms of trying to protect people. And there's always sort of this unintended consequence that occurs when you actually create a law to try and protect people, that it can actually work in a sort of reverse or an opposite angle for other people, that was unintended consequences of it. And I see this happen day in and day out. And and they're the little gotchas that I have to think about, that other people aren't thinking about, and go, yeah, but this could happen. Did you? And they go, oh yeah, it probably could happen. So therefore I need to think about that too. And so the intersection between risk and protection is a really interesting one in business, and the way that governments work from a making of law perspective. And yes, the laws are there to try and protect us and support us, but a lot of the times they actually create even more issues for us to deal with from a business perspective.
And then there's an emotional component about it, because I remember years ago being told about some research that was done about children. I think it was children playing on off the ground kind of equipment, or climbing trees or something like that. So something that would be deemed by parents generally to be a higher risk activity. And they found that children had more accidents when they were being watched by their parents than when they weren't. Which is interesting and doesn't surprise me at all. And I don't know where that research came from, so I wouldn't want to be quoted on it. But certainly what I see in my work is that the more somebody is afraid of something happening, the more likely it is to happen. That when we are afraid of things, we give energy to those things, we give attention to them, and that literally, if you like, attracts those negative events towards us at an energetic level. So it's a very delicate balance that you have to run, because if you become over-focused on risk, you actually contribute, I would say, to that, whatever it is that's being protected from actually happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I often think of the analogy that about driving a car, and when you're driving a car, you always get taught to look to where you want to go to. So if you to look around the corner, or to look, to the direction that you're going into, and not to the direction you don't want to go into. And so therefore, because if you focus on the direction that you don't want to go into, so, oh, there's a tree in front of me, I better avoid that particular tree, but you're looking straight at the tree. And typically, if you do that, you've got a greater chance of driving your car into the tree. So therefore, you always make sure that you're focused away from the object you don't want to hit. Obviously,
and that's much more obvious if you're doing something like mountain biking or skiing, where you can really easily fall over. If you mountain bike and you're going downhill and you look anywhere except where you want to go to, you're finished, aren't you?
That's right. And so you look at that, and that's the analogy that I use with what you're talking about, it being in business, is that you need to be aware that the trees are there, okay, and the objects are there that could possibly hurt you, but then also keep your eyes on the track and on the road, which is the strategy. So if you use that analogy, you set the strategy, you set the path, you set the direction in which you want to go to, but you do that with understanding that there's danger and risk with things that are going on around you constantly, that you have to then make sure you're not completely blind by it, because there might be a tree that just automatically pops up that you weren't aware of. Probably not a tree, but it may be a ditch or a hole that you weren't expecting in front of you when you're going on that pathway. And so therefore it is this balance that happens all the time between risk and maybe creativity is I know that's not the opposite to risk, but sort of that focus or the discipline of staying on the same path. And so when you're talking about that, you don't want to just be constantly thinking about what's to the left or the right of you, but what's in front of you is the most important part. And I see this time and time again where businesses just focus on the periphery. They start to lose this momentum. They start to lose this, the pathway forward, because they're worried about what's going on around them as opposed to what's in front of them. And I think that's and I see bigger business that become more paralyzed because they're so worried about what's going on around them and what could possibly go wrong. Whereas entrepreneurial businesses are probably a little bit opposite to that they're thinking there's nothing that's going on the side of them, that they're just seeing this wonderful pathway in front of them from that point of view. So probably it's interesting on a personal level, what I find I tend to do is take the temperature of the person that I'm talking to about risk. And so if they're on the overly risky side of the fence and they're worried about everything that's going on, I'll balance them up and actually say, hang on a minute, don't worry about that. Let's focus on the road in front. But if I get somebody who's very entrepreneurial and creative and not really thinking about risk at all, I have to play that devil's advocate person that sits on the side and say, hang on a minute, there's this stuff that sits over here. So maybe I become that sort of risk meter for people.
I think we need to find somebody to replace the devil's advocate. I hear people all the time saying, "Oh, I'm just playing devil's advocate," and it seems to, when people have that way of thinking, it seems to actually put them in the way of asking questions that are really not always the right questions to ask. Mm-hmm. And I think the whole devil's advocate thinking has actually got us a little bit unstuck. I'm not sure what would be the right way of looking at it, but whenever I hear that expression now, there's a little bit of a red flag that starts to play for me. Like, okay, so what of this commentary from this devil's advocate do we need to listen to? What is seriously talking about things that we need to take account of and possibly shift our strategy around or be highly aware of? And what of it is just asking questions to see if we can be tripped up? And I think the devil's advocate trips people up a lot. I don't think that you do that, but I think a lot of people do, actually. It's almost like they like the intellectual exercise of trying to show you what could go wrong, when a lot of it is probably not relevant. So I'm wondering who we can replace the devil's advocate with, because I think there's a better role to be played there.
I was reflecting on that because I did say the word devil's advocate, and when you picked me up on it just then, I actually hate the word, to be honest.
I'm sure you do. It rolls off the tongue so easily, but I think it rolls us into behaving like a devil's advocate, which is a stupid thing to do, isn't it?
What would you replace it with? And I think the word that came for me is to become what I call being commercial.
Okay? Well, that's way more positive. That feels really grounded, doesn't it, and helpful.
Because being commercial about something is kind of like being realistic about it. So
yeah,
you can look at all the spectrum of all the things that can go really right and can go really wrong. And then you start to look at the probability of these things going right or wrong and taking a commercial balanced view of the world to say, okay, well, I know that the trees are on the left and they're on the right. I know that they're there. I know that there could be a pothole that could come up and actually derail me on my bike. But with the balance of probability, I know the trees are there. I know there could be some sort of pothole that comes up. So instead of going 100 kilometers an hour down the hill, I might go 80 just because I might be able to avoid the pothole if it does come up. So therefore, that becomes a more balanced way of actually proceeding forward than to take risk into consideration, but not be completely paralyzed where you don't get on your bike and actually go down the hill, because that's what happens. People don't proceed. And that point that you made there about people love to throw up the what ifs. Sometimes they throw up the what ifs because they don't want to proceed, because they're scared, and they actually find comfort by saying, well, I didn't go down that particular path because I knew that I was going to fall off and potentially hurt myself. So I'm not going to do it. And so they use it as an excuse. Okay. I'm not saying everybody, but some people can use it in that frame, in that manipulative way. And then I think the ones that you go, well, it's great to acknowledge it. And I love acknowledging all these things. But at the end of the conversation, you say, okay, well, on the balance of probability, what's likely to occur, what's not likely to occur? Let's make a commercial balanced decision about this to proceed down the pathway.
It's interesting you're bringing in the word balance, because I think these analogies with driving and mountain bike riding and skiing are really good ones, because I can feel inside myself that feeling. I used to ski a lot, that feeling where you get a kind of reckless abandon, where you're taking risks that you may get away with it, but you may not. And that's really risky, especially if you're on a very difficult slope or in very challenging terrain. That's very different from doing something that's challenging, but where you have a balance is the word, where you're able to maintain your balance. And there's a kind of dream state that we all long to experience, where you go down this incredibly difficult run. Or I've only done a tiny bit of mountain biking, but I had the same feeling, probably because I'd skied, where, to me, we were going really fast downhill. And as long as I kept looking forward, whatever came, I was able to deal with. But if for a moment, my mind went off into what if, then I didn't have the presence or the intuition to, sometimes even intuition prevents you from landing in places that will hurt you. So the minute I started to think about what if, I lost that connection with where I was. So there's something very powerful, I think, in being able to be commercial so you're grounded, which means like you're on your bike, you're going down the hill and you're going at a reasonable speed. You're not just kind of like dithering your way down, or you're on your skis and you're going. And at the same time, you don't have that recklessness, which is just like throwing yourself away, throwing your opportunity away.
It's interesting you use that analogy to talk about skiing. As you know, I love to ski as well. And I was just reflecting then about skiing. When I was a younger person, 30 years ago skiing, I would be a lot more reckless than I am today. Okay, I would go down black mogul, double black diamond mogul runs, that could possibly end up off the side of a cliff. And, I'd snap skis and break stocks and that sort of type stuff and manage to avoid any sort of serious injury. But I love that adrenaline, that risk that came along with the fact that you're on the edge. And now there's no way I would do any of the things that I would have done in the past. And I don't like actually skiing out of control anymore. I actually like skiing, up to that point where you're skiing hard, but still in control, that you know that you're not going to do yourself any damage. So I wonder whether age has got anything to do with this as well, and age of the person in business as well. So not just the person's age, but also the age of the organization, and whether you're more prepared to take risks when there's less at stake. Because when you're 20, you probably feel a lot more invincible, and when you're at 50 sort of type principle, and you also aren't thinking about what could possibly go wrong either. So you're kind of blinded. So there's a whole lot of analogies that come in when you're thinking about this scheme. But the other one that I wanted to mention is this confidence issue. Like, you're so much more confident. You're going, I can go down that. I can have a crack at that. I'll be fine. And typically those people, like probably in my 20s, I was fine because I had that attitude. But in my 50s, I don't have that attitude as much anymore. And therefore, if I did go down those runs that I used to when I was younger, I probably would hurt myself because of that lack of confidence just to drive you through it.
Yeah, or maybe the fear, which brings tension. So I wanted to ask you, I think you may have answered it already. Are you a better skier now than you were when you were younger?
Yes.
Oh, well, you see, so that's really interesting, isn't it?
Technically better skier I am nowadays, but I can probably do less. I can get down. I don't get down as. I don't go as hard in terms of some of the runs that I would do. So if that makes sense.
But going hard isn't necessarily better. It's just going harder, isn't it?
it's going harder and doing harder runs and doing things that probably look a bit better, but probably aren't better for you. If that makes sense.
Well, so that I think that's actually a very interesting answer to the question, and it's good to bring that back to business, because it really makes us look at this non-devil's advocate. So this commercial, this person who sits there and says, is this commercial? How do you keep this commercial? How do you keep this show on the road? Because if you take too much risk, it might just blow off the road. If you don't take any risk at all, it's never going to get started. You're not going to have a business. If you get too risk averse, you're going to stall the business in the middle. It's going to lose momentum. So how do we keep it commercial and keep it creative at the same time? Keep the life in it and the juice in it, because otherwise it just becomes kind of like a set of activities that pay people's bills. And there's very little spirit in it.
Yeah, it's interesting because it also, the 3 o'clock in the morning wake up that happens a lot, and especially to business owners, that's something will pop into their mind that could possibly go wrong, and that gets them worried. And you worry from probably about the hours of 3 till 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning when you get up, and then you get on with your day, and then you reflect back on that period of time that you were worried about something, and then the cold light of day says, you know what? The likelihood of that actually occurring is probably so limited that I don't necessarily need to think about or worry about it. But at the time, at 3 o'clock, you actually thinking that it's a real strong possibility this is going to occur, which then becomes debilitating, because if you follow that through for the rest of the day, as you say, it could possibly stall your business. So there's a thing that obviously happens too, where your brain must recalibrate the thing that's occurred, or that the event that might have occurred in your brain at that point in time.
Well, I think without knowing all the physiological systems and things, that our emotions and our thoughts are so often fired by what's going on in our body. So, like, for example, if I forget to drink a second cup of water, or occasionally I forget to drink water first thing when I wake up, I just completely forget. And after about a couple of hours, I can literally feel that my emotions are beginning to go a bit off. And then it's like, oh, sorry, you didn't drink any water. And then I'm back on track again. So when any of our physiological systems change, and at that time of the morning, that's when people have most likely to have heart attacks and all kinds of stuff. So obviously the physiological system is low in some way at that time. And so the thoughts are going to go with that. The thoughts don't have any particular reality there. We produce more negative thoughts when our systems are in that kind of state. So I guess we need to learn to recognize when something's off and not even take it seriously. Like anything that you think at 3 a.m. should probably not be taken seriously, or at least needs the daylight to check in with it. But we take all of our thoughts so seriously so much of the time. It's like they're all equal, which they are not by any stretch of the imagination.
Which is true, but it's hard to differentiate that when you're in that emotion at that particular point in time, fearing that could possibly occur. But then there's also useful time between 3 and 6, as we discussed before, where you may have been able to problem solve something that in the quiet time that you may not necessarily have been able to problem solve when things get busy during the day, sort of type thing. So there's some usefulness associated with that as well. Or even when that risk comes up, either know that it exists, but know that you've actually dealt with it. Even if you've ignored it, you've dealt with it because of that pure act of ignoring it means that it probably wasn't as big an issue as probably what you thought it was going to be.
And you didn't give it power.
Yeah, that's right. Going back to your point before about if you keep looking at the thing you don't want to actually have happen, you're more likely for it to happen, and so therefore you're avoiding it.
I noticed that, especially where I'm not the main person in a business, so where I'm working with somebody else's business, or I'm involved with a business, but I'm not the central focus in leadership terms. I noticed that a huge amount of my energy, I actually work probably with risk a lot, but in a very different way. So if I feel any red flags come up, and I'll feel them energetically, so I'll feel a response in my energy that doesn't feel good. Just doesn't feel whole and grounded and satisfying and fulfilling, I will take that very seriously and do whatever I can, and hopefully with whoever else is involved, to find, before anything happens, to find an energy, so a feeling that is good about the situation, which means that we resolve it before it hits. And therefore, it never has the chance to grow into something. And one of my big questions these days, and why I was interested in this topic, is like, how good can we get at that? And if we have a larger organization, how do we share that culture where you can prevent things from going wrong by really listening? It's almost like you're listening into the future. And instead of saying, oh, well, that's far away, you say, no, that's actually serious. So as you build the foundations of a business, you're wanting to build it on foundations that will produce the fulfillment of the business, if you like, will produce the results that you're looking for. And I'm often wondering about that, and then about really serious risks and things that might come, blindside type of risks, and what are the things that I can't feel or I can't see yet. And I think that it's a very important part, actually, of running a business. But again, it needs to be, when I do it well, what I do is I open up for greater creativity. But that creativity is, for me, what makes us more commercial, because creativity for me is not having ideas, it's making ideas work, it's bringing things to the ground. So they have to be commercial if we're talking about business. And so I think there's a very dynamic relationship here between all the red flags, which are the risk things, and then the creative impulse to make something that changes people's lives, or that is very successful or very impactful, or whatever it is. And if I actually think that if we go too far one way or the other, we start to lose touch with reality. If we get too creative, is another way of talking about what we've been talking about. It's not only about the risk, but we don't listen to the subtle signals are saying, hold on a moment, there's a better way of doing it. And if we get too much, if we only say, oh, well, if you do this, this is going to happen. If you do that, that's going to happen. So we get too much into the red flags and we don't bring creativity to those. We clearly stall ourselves, but we also limit the creative spirit of the business, which makes people feel constrained and like they don't feel freedom any longer within that business. And as human beings, we so long and love to feel free. So I think this is part of a much bigger exploration of how do we run businesses from an energetic perspective, as well as just in the traditional terms of risk and creativity and entrepreneurialism and protection.
I think that's right. And I just thought of something then about size of business. And as you go from being small, when it's predominantly yourself and maybe a few other people around you, and as you grow, you're having more and more people around you. Now, when you have more and more people around you, you have more voices, and more voices will come in that will actually be on the negative and the positive side of things, on the risk or on the creative side of things. And you've got to listen. You talked about listening. You've got to listen to more of those. And then you've got to decipher which ones are the right pathway forward. And this is the issue that then you've got when you talk about energy. You've got to then feel the pathway forward. But then, depending on how strong the voices are, because if you've got a lot of voices in your organization that are on the risk side of the fence, and you energetically know that that's not right, that you're out of balance by listening to those people, then you've got to take those people on the journey with you to move them from the risk side of the fence to probably the more of the balanced commercial side of the fence. And so therefore, that's where it becomes, I think, more and more difficult, because you've got more and more voices to deal with, which confuses your own energy as well, because you're trying to listen to everything, understand it all, and then decipher which is the most balanced commercial pathway moving forward. And that can be really hard unless you've got people around you that you can have these sensible conversations with, because if you don't, that's when you can become very confused. And I suppose that's what we tend to do as advisors, and yourself as an advisor, myself as an advisor, is that you're trying to help them decipher all those voices, to feel the energy, to work out where the truth lies, or where the balance is, and where the commercial reality is, to stop listening to the periphery voices.
Yes. Yeah, I'm willing to bet that those voices say remarkably similar things to what the voices in your own head would say. If you weren't surrounded by people, you'd have your own voices in your own head going. And I'm willing to bet that they say almost exactly the same things. It's a different experience, but it's the same phenomenon.
Yes, because they're typically a reflection of you, whoever you employ.
Unfortunately, or sometimes unfortunately, but well, I mean, it's good really, isn't it? Because then you can see your own tendency. So if you find that people are constantly bringing up the risks and what could go wrong, you can recognize that tendency in yourself, like, oh, clearly I've got that energy pretty strongly. If I've seen people who come up with really crazy ideas which are completely ungrounded and unrealistic, and I always recognize, like, I had a long time when I was like that myself, and probably still have a tendency from time to time to just be completely ungrounded about things, and then it pops up in somebody around me. It's like, oh, there you go, Sarah, you remember, that's not going to work. That kind of energy doesn't work. And so I find that that's a pull for me to become more conscious, like what really works, whether it's how do I lead in this situation, so that I don't just ignore some people and listen to some people, or ignore some voices and listen to others, because that, in the end, it doesn't really work like that. It's somehow, how do we harmonize all of this together to create a good outcome for the whole and the parts of the whole? To me, that's the purpose of taking the conversation deeper, is that we're looking for a more comprehensive solution.
Yeah, I really like this concept of the commercial balance, because the commercial balance is something that we're taking all the information into consideration, so we're not being irresponsible and just plowing forward without thinking about the periphery. And then you're making a decision and a pathway forward based on that information, but then tapping into, like what you're talking about, with the energy of it, and saying, well, actually, based on all the things that I know, my energy and the energy of the situation suggests that I should be moving in that particular direction, because that feels right. That feels like it's the right pathway. So I'm acutely aware that things could go wrong, but I'm also acutely aware that things could go right too, and going down this particular pathway. And so I really like that concept of talking. And I talk about commercial business all the time, and commercial realities. And so actually it feels a lot nicer to be able to say, I'm your commercial barometer, as opposed to the devil's advocate.
Oh, that's such an improvement. Isn't it amazing how different that is?
Yeah, because that's effectively what we do. We're looking for the commercial pathway forward.
Because that means you're taking care of the success of the business. That's you're right. Rooting for the success of the business, rather than looking for what could possibly go wrong. Like, the devil's advocate is so clever. Like, okay, yeah, I can chalk one up to me. I can chalk another one up to me. I won that argument. It's like, well, so what? Did you make the business more successful? So the commercial barometer, I love that. Anytime anyone says to me I'm playing devil's advocate, I'm going to have a word with them about it in future. It's like, no more devil's advocates in my environment.
We only want commercial barometers. There you go.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a commercial barometer. I think that's great. It feels really powerful.
Yeah, it does, because it feels realistic, and something that I like to use the term realistically positive. So or positive realistic. So it means that you're still on the optimistic side of the fence, which you need to be able to run a business, because that gives you that, as you say, gets that momentum going forward. But you have to be a realist to say, well, hang on a minute, things can go wrong, and we've got to make sure that we're taking the right commercial pathway forward.
And that's what we call functional positive. We made a whole podcast once about positive and negative, and functional positive and functional negative, which is a different version of this risk and creativity and all of that. So, which creates a functioning business. That feels pretty good to me.
So now we're going to talk about being commercially balanced and having a barometer to measure that to make sure that we get the right pathway moving forward.
Good. I'm up for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to The Spirit of Business with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum. We'll be back next week with another episode. You'll find the show notes with links and other useful information on our website, spiritofbusiness.live. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends.